In this video, I'd like to discuss some of the military innovations that Napoleon had a part in creating, and also sort of what type of military he inherited and what changes he made to it. In order to basically better understand the Napoleonic Wars themselves, which we'll talk about in the next video. Well, what had been going on in Europe in terms of military innovations before Napoleon had largely been the endeavors of Frederick the Great, who we've talked about. But Frederick the Great, for all of the sort of innovations that he brought to the table, war was still very limited. So there was what military historians refer to as this limited war, meaning you still had a block of soldiers. And yes, you could have soldiers on the left flank and the right flank and in the center, but they're all basically marching in line towards one battlefield, and they're all pretty much going to engage the enemy at the same time. What you will see with the Revolutionary Wars and then the basically this French citizen army that Napoleon inherits is a much different kind of war, a more general war, a more total war. So what were some of the changes in the French military before Napoleon, during the period after Frederick the Great? Well, a lot had been learned, as I said, by the French soldiers who had fought in the American Revolution. The American Revolution was largely fought at different times during the war by civilian armies, by militia. And very unusual tactics were used by General Washington and the French commander Lafayette, utilizing the militia, fighting at night, fighting during the winter, and using these sort of different psychological methods to make themselves appear weaker than they were, or at different times stronger than they were. So the French officers had learned quite a bit from the American Revolution. Another thing was mentioned previously: French artillery, French cannons. By this time, they were the best in Europe. They were not the biggest, but that made them lighter. It made them more mobile. It meant that they could be moved on the battlefield. They were not simply a fixed position. In other words, once they were put on the battlefield, they could be moved from one side to the other, closer, and so on. And that was something that really no other army that Napoleon would face had. There had also been advances made in siege warfare and fortifications by a French military innovator named Vauban, known for his star fortifications. But the artillery really, under Napoleon, and remember he was an artillery officer, really became the decisive arm of the military. So between the infantry, soldiers on their feet, the cavalry, soldiers on horses, and the artillery, it really became that thing that really set the French apart on the battlefield. But what about the soldiers themselves? Well, this was, remember, a period where a lot of the officers that had been nobles were either killed during the Revolution or had left. So what you had was, you did have some of the old guard. Remember, now a lot of the soldiers had joined with the Revolution, remember, at the Bastille and so on. But Napoleon had to rely on conscription, meaning he basically more or less forced French citizens to join his cause. At the beginning, he had no problem with this because they were waiting in lines to volunteer for Napoleon's army. But these were largely farmers and people who had no military experience. So how do you deal with, yes, a large army, but a large civilian army? How do you train them? And what he came up with was the Demi Brigade, Demi, and then Brigade, Brigade, in which he would put certain members of the old guard as officers together with new citizen soldiers, and they would train them, and often they could train them on the march into engagements, whether we're talking about in Italy or in other places, as we'll discuss. So it was a mixture of old regime troops and civilians, but they were being trained in this grand French style of warfare. Also, as we talked about, promotion was something that could happen for anyone. And so anyone, it was, remember, a meritocracy ruled the military under Napoleon. So anyone could rise all the way up to the rank of general based on their merits. And so as certain people rose, they were able to lead their own demi brigades and again train new civilians. So it was a very successful way of training large amounts of civilians. Sometimes, as I said, on the very march to an engagement or on a campaign. What about the issue of feeding the army? Well, one of the things Napoleon does here is he has his troops divided into different corps, and I'll get to that in a second. But basically, what he then allowed was the independence of these various corps, who would be led by one of his marshals, one of his top generals, and if supplies were moving as they should, food supplies would also be moving up the lines and things would be okay. But what happens when you kind of stretch beyond those lines? And this is where Napoleon's army relied on foraging, something that had sort of previously been frowned upon because it meant involving civilians in warfare. In other words, soldiers would be sent out to forage or steal from civilians. So one corps might send out a handful of soldiers with the orders of some men getting, let's say, chickens and eggs, and another getting cheese, and another getting wine, bringing this back so that the men could continue to march, eat, and not have to stop or have to wait on the food lines. This meant that Napoleon's army could be on the march basically 24 hours a day if need be. And so more about this corps system. Well, what we're talking about, if you think about it like this, if you make a fist with your hand and you put it out in front of you, this would be like the old Frederick the Great limited warfare type of army, right? It's one punch. It's one giant group of soldiers all moving towards the same target. And that means that they all have to be there, presumably, at the same time. But if you now put release your fist and put your fingers out in front of you, you have basically now 5 different lines, and these made up the corps. So they're independent lines that each have their own attached artillery, cavalry, and infantry, again under the command of a marshal. And this allows them again to move independently. So they don't have to, they're not going to all meet on the same battlefield at the same time, but certain corps can be winding around through the left, through towns and cities there, another down to the south on the right flank, and the enemy never really knows where the main force is, which finger is the main force, where is Napoleon going to attack, the center, the left, or the right. And it also allows for, once the battle has begun, Napoleon's order to his marshals was, when you hear the guns, when you hear that battle has begun, that's when you need to make your way towards the sound of the guns. So while the enemy may have done reconnaissance and think that they're, let's say, up against a force of 30,000, by the time other corps arrive in sometimes critical moments, Napoleon might have as much as 60 plus thousand men, and they're coming in on the left flank, on the right flank, and they're coming in while the other soldiers, the enemy soldiers, probably are very tired. Now the soldiers marching, of course, would be tired from marching, but they would often engage even after long periods of marching. This corps system completely changes warfare in Europe, and Napoleon is the one behind it. The question, who did Napoleon study? Was he truly a student of military history and so on? Well, yes, he was, but a lot of it was seemingly innate, that he had learned on the battlefield. But he did study some of the greats, like Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Eugene, the Prince of Savoy. But he was a genius after all, and so he was largely self-taught. But he did, being a genius is one part of it. The other is preparation, and even a genius must prepare for a campaign. And before any given campaign, he would have endless books brought to him, maps that he would lay out on the floor, learning the topography of the region he was going to be in. Where were the towns? Where were the lakes? Where could the men forage for food? Looking at previous campaigns of previous military leaders. Trying to learn where the enemy was likely to deploy their troops, and for him to not deploy there and try and surprise them. Also, he often relied on reconnaissance, sending spies or agents out for intelligence on what's the size of the enemy army, where are they located, do they have high morale, low morale, whatever. And so Napoleon he worked basically as a one-man chief of staff. He micromanaged everything. And so he was able to fully dictate all orders from the highest level to the lowest. What do I mean by the highest? Well, basically before a battle you would come up with a grand strategy. And for Napoleon, the grand strategy was almost always this: divide and conquer. He was often up against various armies, and that his enemies that they had their own problems with that. They spoke different languages. They didn't want to be under the command of someone else's general or so on. So that was in Napoleon's favor. But they also had to march and meet each other. And Napoleon's grand strategy was almost always to keep the two armies from meeting and basically take one out and then take the other out. And it worked for him time and time again. He also worked on the operational level with the different columns. Although he allowed them definitely sort of independence with their marshals, he expected them to march to the sound of the guns and be there when they were needed. But he would also micromanage on the battlefield and at the smallest tactical level, say an individual corps or even a smaller group of soldiers. If he saw that they needed to be moved into a certain area during the critical moments of battle, then he would do it either himself, or he would have a marshal go and give the order. And he relied largely on psychological warfare, making himself look weaker than he was, and various ways of just basically kind of psyching his enemy out, of which they often couldn't imagine that he, with his one citizen army, could defeat, say, the armies of the combined armies of Austria and Russia, as we'll see at the Battle of Austerlitz. And yet he did time and time again. And these are the different mechanisms for which Napoleon was able to win so many victories. So while we won't be able to look at each battle and victory, I wanted to give sort of a general understanding of what made his army different and what made Napoleon so effective on the battlefield. So in the next video, we'll look sort of generally at the Napoleonic Wars and then the downfall of Napoleon.